Welcome to the Dr. Broadway Podcast, the theater history podcast where a couple of doctors sit around and talk about Broadway. I'm your co-host, Dr. Kristin Stultz Pressley, joined as always by Dr. Tracey Brent-Chessum. On this episode, we're going to talk a little bit about the shape this podcast is going to take. This is episode 1.1. This is where we tell you why we're doing this, how we're planning to do this. And so Tracey, in all of her wisdom, has titled this Introduction and Methodology. Tracey, why don't you tell us what you had in mind when you wrote that on this Google Doc that I am staring at right now?
Honestly, introduction and methodology, I didn't ever intend for anyone to see, just you.
Uh-oh, the cat's out of the bag.
I know. I was like, I kind of felt like methodology would scare people. Like, honestly, when we started talking about this, we wanted there to be an easy way to pull the information a theatergoer needed. And so this introduction kind of tells you a little bit about us, about how we're putting where we come from as historians, but also a little bit about how to find the information you need so that you're not having to listen to the whole podcast. I mean, we hope you do, but you don't have to listen to every episode to get the information you need if you're going to see a specific show downtown. So that was what I was kind of thinking through when we were saying episode 1. I was like, okay, well, let's introduce us and then make sure that people know how to get the information they need. And that comes a little bit later, but that's what we were thinking.
Excellent. And I want to say, just by way of introduction, we're going to get in just a minute to where we introduce ourselves and we talk a little bit about how we met and the way that we work together. But I want to also just say at the outset, I get asked very often, where did this name Dr. Broadway come from? So I want to go through that. It's a real quick story. When I finished my PhD, one of my dearest friends was a brilliant photographer, and he was so kind and offered to take my pictures in my regalia, which I don't think I've worn since graduation. I'm sure you've had more opportunities to wear yours than I have had to wear mine, but I have worn mine once. And twice, once for this photo shoot and once for graduation. And so he took my photos, and when he brought back this print of me in that, what is it, 6 or 8 point thing
Yep.
that we wear, and this giant, I look like the Marshmallow Man.
It's like the 80s on steroids with the shoulder pad.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So he showed me this picture of me and all that regalia, and I'm holding the Maslon Broadway, the American Musical book, right? The giant 1,000-page photo book that went with the 2004 documentary or 2003 documentary, whenever it came out. And I'm holding that and I'm looking up over it. And I said, oh my gosh, I love it. I look like Dr. Broadway. And that was it. It just stuck. And it really, truly, it gave me a direction. That was 2011. By later that day, I owned the domain drbroadway.com. Then we went into branding and all of that. And since then, I have operated my business under the name drbroadway.com. And the mission has remained the same from the very outset in 2011. My mission is educating theatergoers and enhancing theatergoing. And there's our hope as we go throughout this podcast that not only will you learn from listening to the podcast, but also that you'll learn how to go in search of this information yourself before you see a show. So there you know where Dr. Broadway came from. So that's off the table. Nobody has to wonder anymore. But now, Tracey, I'm going to let you talk about how the two of us connected.
Well, obviously a very, very long and involved story. I was doing a paper in London at Goldsmiths.
Mm-hmm.
Was it Goldsmiths University?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was like my first big international paper. I was terrified. I got on a plane by myself and navigated. First time I'd ever traveled abroad by myself. I was in my 20s still, and it was like, oh my gosh. And was on this panel with someone else at the University of Maryland. Oh, the University of Maryland, right here. And he said, I've got this friend. She's doing great things. I think you were still at Kentucky.
I think I was at Georgia by that point.
You were at Georgia,
Kentucky, and was at the University of Georgia. Yep.
Yeah, and so got this. We're going to put her on our panel, and it's going to be great. I'm like, wonderful. So went to the conference, got there, gave my paper, and then you waltzed in, and you sat down and stunned everyone. Everyone was glued to, and I was like, I am not a good speaker. This is a good speaker. Oh my goodness.
For the
I was
record,
like,
I do not remember
because
that at all.
no, you were so like animated and great about it. That's what I remember about it so much. And then we ended up, I think your parents were
Yes,
with you.
because you may have traveled across the world on your own, but my parents heard I was going, were like, well, you're not going by yourself. I
Well, it was
also was in my 20s.
well, I mean, it was really nice of them because then they took us all out for dinner.
I do
I
remember
remember
that.
that too.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it was a lovely dinner. We have a picture out in front of it.
Yes.
Um,
And
Kristen
I will
came
share
in.
that on our Instagram post,
Yeah.
by the way. Our Instagram page, just should you want to check it out, is at Dr. Bway Podcast. And I will share that photo on that account.
Yeah, and I had forgotten all about it until you showed it to a class that I had you teach when I was on maternity leave. And I was like, oh my goodness, I forgot all about that. But we had a wonderful time. So that's how we met. And then we've just kind of been like passing like ships in the night. And then, as I said, I was going on uh, basically maternity leave. And we needed somebody to teach theater history, and there's like no one in the state of
Mhm.
Georgia that can get
Mhm.
checked off by SACS to teach theater
Yeah.
history um, in small universities. It's a little easier to do in the bigger universities, and you were the person, so you drove all the way from like the North Carolina border
I
once a
did.
week
I
and
did.
taught two sections of the class so that I could stay home with those babies for a little while. And I was very, very appreciative, but I forgot all about that.
Well, I was equally appreciative because, and we'll get to this when I talk a little bit more about myself, I'm a homeschooling mother of two preteen boys whom I adore. But the idea of having one day a week where I get to be in my car for what, 5 hours of travel time plus 2 hours or three, whatever, 3 hours of teaching, that was a gift to me as well. So don't underestimate. I'm not sure who was helping who more in that situation.
Oh,
But yeah, I definitely remember getting that call from Doug Reside, who is a name many people listening to this podcast will likely recognize. Doug and I met at the University of Kentucky. He was getting a graduate degree in computer science, I think. Is that right? Did he do computer or English? I can't
I
remember.
think he
And
did English, but
did
it was
he? Okay.
yeah,
He was always doing the computer side of things,
yeah,
digitizing things like that. And I was
very
studying.
pre-AI kind of
Yes,
like
yes, Doug was at the
think
fore.
tank
Yes, he
stuff.
was always at the fore. Well, when I went into UK to pursue my master's in theater, we were put into micro teaches where we would have small groups of TAs, and then we would, within that group, teach each other. And I didn't know Doug from Adam's House Cat. And we get put in this group together. And I teach about how to tell the difference between a musical and a play with music. And of course, Doug is sitting on the front row answering every question. And we became friends for life. So Doug and I connected that way. Then he went on to Maryland, where he met you.
Yeah, and he worked
I
at the
went on to
Myth
the,
Lab.
okay,
So he was in what they called then digital humanities, like how do
that's
we
right.
digitize
That's
the
right.
humanities? And he was
Yes.
working on, I think, digitizing Parade still, or
I
that may
think
have
you're
been
right. He
his.
was definitely working with Jason Robert Brown.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
it was something that he was doing there. And then one of our theater professors got wind of what he was doing and was like, "Why are you in English? Tracey does musical theater over here. She's our
Right.
musical theater. You two should meet." And so then that's
Yes.
how I met Doug.
The rest is history. And so, yeah, I went to University of Georgia for my PhD and got this email or call, I don't remember, from Doug saying, "Hey, you want to do this panel?" And in London at Goldsmiths, and the panel was on, wasn't it musicals of the 30s or something? I talked about The Drowsy Chaperone and how it was more like a British musical than like an
Yeah.
American musical.
Yeah, and I was talking about like my early dissertation stuff, which was all on John Philip Sousa's musicals that
Right.
were then translated and kind of changed and rewritten and reinterpolated for British audiences. So it was
Yeah.
all kind of part and parcel of the same thing.
Yeah.
And that was
So
a crazy
that's
conference. it was
Right.
it was insane because it was like a whole bunch of like scholars like we understand in America, like people who teach at university, and then half the group was gentlemen scholars. So
Right.
there's lots and lots of guys that it's just like this is just one of the things that I study on my own, and it was just provided an amazing little perspective to of
Yes. Yes.
kind of how different historians approach
Yeah.
um
Right.
history. It was fun. We had a great
Yeah.
time.
And then subsequently, like Tracy said, we went back to school, we finished our degrees, and then Tracy has just continued to be such a supporter of mine. I remember you probably don't, you may not even remember this. You sent me work from Indiana Wesleyan University. Remember there was a writing a curriculum, like an online curriculum or something like that?
Vaguely.
You sent that to me when I was staying home with little babies,
Yeah,
and it was
because
such a gift.
I had finally gotten out of the adjunct. We were moving and I couldn't do it anymore. And I'm like, hold on,
Yeah.
we're gonna send this to
Well,
Kristin.
that was a huge gift that I have never forgotten. And then, like you said, getting the chance to teach for the Gainesville Theater Alliance, which is Brown University and North Georgia or University of North Georgia, their combined theater program, and I was able to teach so that Tracy could be home with her baby girls. And that leads me to my next point. Why don't we more specifically introduce ourselves at this point, and then we'll talk about why is it important to study theater history.
Cool.
So you go
Oh,
for it.
you want me to go first? Oh,
You
okay.
go first.
All right. So I went to a very, very small undergrad liberal arts program. We didn't have a theater degree, but they said, come anyway. They're like, we have a little theater program and you can get really involved and you can do all of this stuff with it. Um, and to me, that sounded really fun. It meant that I could direct and I could do I could do very hands-on things and I didn't have to wait for 2 or 3 years to have the seniority to do it. And I thought that that sounded attractive. I'm going to say right now, don't do that. If you're picking a college program, don't do that. Um, but I did, and I learned a lot. I learned tons, and mostly thanks to the kind of mentorship of some of the other professors who just saw that like I was capable, but was young, and so learned a lot in that arena. We'll put it that
Mm-hmm.
way.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, as soon as I graduated, they actually asked me to stay on and be kind of the director of theater, and we started creating a degree underneath their communications department. Again, don't do this when you are that young. This is not
I
there.
didn't
So
know that. That's fascinating.
yeah, and so I actually ended up starting to get a master's degree at that point while I was and then teaching in the high school full time.
Yeah.
And it just ended up being, I think, too much. And so I said no to that and kind of stepped into my high school teaching for quite a while, and then got my master's a couple years later. I first got a master's degree in, of all things, choral conducting. It sounds very weird, but when you first start out, this was so early, there was only one master's degree in the entire country that could say musical theater on it. And it was very performance based. And for as much as my little heart always wanted to be a performer, I have 15 left feet and fall on my face and bruise my nose, and it's
Girl, you and
bad.
me both. You
It's
and me
so
both.
it's so sad. And we're just so far past the musicals where you could just walk onto the stage and park and bark. Like it's just they're
Right.
over.
I'm not
So
even sure I could have done that though, to be
it
honest.
just wasn't gonna happen. So yeah. So I ended up doing a master's degree at Azusa Pacific University in California in choral conducting, because that's what I was doing at the high school level. Thought that that was that made sense because what I was trying to do, and I kept telling my professors, I'm like, I'm trying to gain like the master's degree level skills in all of these different disciplines that musical theater uses because I want to be a good director. And so that's kind of where that came from. I ended up going from there to getting a master's in humanities at CSU Dominguez Hills, where I focused on theater and performance, and specifically Shakespearean performance of all things, and the role of boy players and how
Interesting.
female actresses really do kind of change the entire dynamic of Shakespeare. And then from there, got into the University of Maryland in their theater and performance studies program. And that was a gift, an absolute gift. It was wonderful. I had great mentors. Dr. Heather Nathans was my dissertation chair, and now she's like, I think she's a dean at Tufts of all things. Like she's just going to be a president someday. She's one of those. But I got lots of really great opportunities at the University of Maryland. While I was there with a couple of friends, we started a nonprofit theater company called Palace Theater Collective in Washington, D.C. And the whole purpose of that was to kind of help develop the next generation of American musicals. One of the things that we thought about was the fact that there's signature theater and arena theater in Washington, D.C. They both develop new musicals and send them to Broadway. But every time I went to go see an out-of-town tryout, it was the same names I was seeing over and over and over again. And I just remember being like, oh, so you have to have a name before you can actually get into these programs, because their programs are fantastic as far as kind of the development of these seminal work. I mean, some of them are really, really, really great. And I just said, well, then who does it for the kids that are just starting out? Like, what about if it's their first musical or their second? And so Palace we always kind of said we wanted to stand in the gap between, college and your first writing experience and the regional theaters. And that's very much what we did. So we'd take, there'd be a big submission process. And when we would choose musicals, it would be a 2-year process with us of development and readings in different places in the country. And there was an entire rationale behind why we did what we did there. And then we'd get them a small kind of up on its feet workshop production so that they could have pictures and marketing materials and demographics from the audience, so they could say to a regional theater, take a chance on us. This is what we know about this musical. This is who your audience is. This is something that you can actually sell. And that's what we focused on. And I did that for about 11 years. 11 seasons? Yes. Oh my goodness. That was a long time.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't realize it was that long.
Yeah.
I didn't realize we were that old, to be honest, Tracey.
I was like, did we do it for 11 years? For some reason, I'm like, there was 11 seasons, wasn't there? It was 11 years from start to finish. I think there was only 9 seasons. That's what it was.
Okay,
there was only 9 seasons in there. But we did lots of new musicals, and it was super fun, and I had a great time. I was exhausted at the end of it, but I had a great time doing it. In the middle, while I was doing all of that in DC, I was also kind of jumping on the tenure track lines, working kind of all over the universe. It felt like spent some time at Ball State in Indiana, and then moved to Point Park University and worked with all of their really just amazing musical theater kiddos. There's a reason they are consistently in the top 10 schools of people represented on Broadway. They're very, very good. And I'm thankful for all of these students that now I get to see doing wonderful things there. It's really fun and very gratifying at that thing. And then kind of got to the point where I was doing a lot of academic-y things like accreditation and curriculum development and all this stuff. And so then I got pulled to become the chair and associate artistic director down here in Georgia at Grinnell University. And they run a partnership with the University of North Georgia called the Gainesville Theater Alliance. And so I was the associate artistic director of the Gainesville Theater Alliance and the chair at Grinnell. And we worked, through that pandemic, which was really, really hard.
Oh, I imagine. Yes, absolutely.
And, this podcast wouldn't be happening without that. I didn't know anything about Zoom or technology. I had to figure it out really quickly. Right. And so, we did. And so I'm thankful for it. It was an interesting time, I think, for everybody. A couple years into that particular job, we decided to start a family, and in good responsible fashion, we thought we had saved all of this money for childcare and everything like that. And then we went to the first sonogram, and there were two of them.
Surprise.
So it was like, so we have identical twin girls. They are almost two now. And it became very obvious that I couldn't do 8 a.m. to 11 p.m. Like staying and making sure an 8 show season got up. Like there was just no way to do that. And so I actually took a step back from academia. The world tells me that I will never get back onto it, and they may be right, but this is just kind of where we are at the moment. I'm having a blast watching 2-year-old brains figure out how to sing right now. They're both trying to learn how to sing. They love singing, they love music, and they're just not quite sure how to do it yet. So
Right.
listening and watching their little wheels go about how do I make these sounds and stuff. So they sing for me now, and I'm supposed to kind of match pitch with them, which basically means that with their little 2-year-old voices, I'm like skrelting my face off trying to like sing with them. So it's fun. I adjunct in the area right now, teaching theater history at Columbus State University in Columbus, Georgia, as well as I jump in at Emory University every once in a while. I'm working on a couple of books, as we always are.
Right.
And then we got the idea to do this podcast, and it's it's a healthy, wonderful thing to kind of keep the brain moving in this direction. So, I've done a lot over the last 10 years. It's like you look back and you're like, I've done quite a bit of writing, quite a bit of presenting at conferences, and when I come back to it every day, my favorite thing to do is teach musical theater history. So
Yeah, same.
here we are.
Same. And, I have to say, the idea of doing a podcast had been floating around in my brain for years. But unlike you, I didn't go through the pandemic working at a university and have to figure out the online component. So the fact that you had, and then you approached me with this idea was such a gift, because I was really paralyzed by my own inability, right? And maybe a lack of ambition to figure things out. I don't know, but it definitely had seemed to me like I had been doing this sort of work for since 2011, and it seemed like the next step for me was a podcast. I just had no idea how to start that. So thank you for moving the ball down the field, to use a sports analogy, which I use a lot of, because in addition to loving theater, I also love sports. So I do love sports. So let me tell you a little bit about myself, and then we'll talk about theater history specifically. All right. So I grew up in the South. That may not surprise some people when they hear me talk to hear that. I grew up in the South and attended a small liberal arts college in Greenville, South Carolina, Furman University, where I, like you, thought I would be a performer. And I went through 4 years there and acted in their shows. I taught at the local children's theater. Everything was great. I did an internship as a theater reviewer one summer, and after I graduated, they asked me to come back full time. I went back full time with the understanding that as soon as I could, I was going to New York. But that never happened. What happened instead was I fell in love with, instead of performing theater, I fell in love with watching other people perform theater and then writing about that. I fell in love with talking to playwrights and directors and hearing why they made the choices that they made. So my whole trajectory of my career changed because of that one internship. So instead of going to New York to pursue performing, which I, like you, God help me if I had done that, I would have been in a world of hurt. Instead,
I would have tripped like on the first. You just trip into the room. That's me.
My goal was, I'm going to win as many Tony Awards as Audra McDonald, and that seems a little bit impossible, right? When you're not all that talented as I was. So I think I'm very fortunate that my trajectory shifted. Thank God for that. So I worked as a theater reviewer in Atlanta for a couple of years, and then decided, okay, I'm going to go to this academic thing. And I did. I started I went to graduate school at UK, as I've mentioned, at the University of Kentucky. And that's where I met Dorothy Fields, lyricist Dorothy Fields, who changed my life. She was the first uh, uh, character from history that I had fallen in love with and that I spent the next 17 years of my life researching. And that came out of my study for my master's thesis. So once I started working on Dorothy Fields, I was like, this is what I'm doing. I'm researching for the rest of my life. And in fact, I'm so thankful to have had an incredible mentor at the University of Kentucky who saw that in me. And while the first year there I was teaching, the second year she was like, why don't you research instead? And it was such a gift to be able to meet with a professional researcher once a week and learn from them and talk
Mhm.
to them about my progress and my goals. And it was wonderful. So and then went to the University of Georgia to get my PhD, continued studying Dorothy Fields, wrote my dissertation about her as well. And then when I graduated from UGA in 2011, that's when I started doing what I'm doing now, which is writing and speaking. The intent had been that I would be a professor and follow the track that you did,
Mhm.
but I ended up having a baby way sooner than I expected that I would. And like you, childcare ain't cheap. So I thought, how can I have my cake and eat it too? Meaning, how can I not have to foot the gigantic childcare bill, be home with my son, and then quickly after him came a second son, and still speak and talk about theater? And the way that that worked out for me was I was invited to speak in my hometown touring house, the Peace Center for the Performing Arts in Greenville, South Carolina. I was invited by their vice president of education at the time to do a lecture before one performance of Les Mis, and I did
Talk
it.
forwards. They're
Oh,
the best.
let me
Nobody
tell you.
stays for a talk back,
Let
people.
me tell
Talk forwards.
you. Well, we ended up doing talk forwards for the next 20 until 2023.
Yeah.
So we did them for 12 seasons. Of course, we took a break at 2020 like everyone did, but we did those, afterwards we had a good crowd. They came to hear about Les Mis, not to hear me. They didn't know me from anybody. And the VP of education then said, why don't you do this for every show? And it became a thing. And the more I did it, the more I fell in love with it. And the more I did it, other people, representatives from other theaters would come hear me speak and say, why don't you come speak at my theater? And why don't you come speak at my theater? And it just snowballed into all of these speaking opportunities. At the same time, because of supportive colleagues like you, I was able to write curriculum for an
Mhm.
online course at Indiana Wesleyan University. And I continued writing about Dorothy Fields, and it really became, that became very much well, it didn't become, it was from the beginning a passion project. And my first book was published. It was a biography of Dorothy Fields published in 2021. Since then, I've continued speaking, like you, continued writing. And I have a new series that's going to be coming out, launching in the fall of 2025 from Methuen Drama. It's called the Essentials series, and it is micro histories of musicals. And so we're employing, theater historians from a variety of different walks of life. And of those, so far, I have written the Pulitzer Prize winners. So there's 10 musicals that have won the Pulitzer Prize, and I wrote micro histories of each of those. And then I'm working currently putting the finishing touches on jukebox musicals. There's way more than 10 of them. So
Mhm.
I had to choose my favorites, or I didn't really choose my favorites. I went by the top 10 longest running
Yeah.
jukebox musicals on Broadway. That
Because
became my methodology there.
there are hundreds, and a lot of them didn't last
And,
more than two or three
And
shows.
that's a question I think we can
It's
discuss at length.
it's
Why
so
do
fun.
some hit and like Mamma Mia hits, obviously, Jersey Boys hits, obviously, but then you have a catalog of music that you think will hit, like Escape to Margaritaville,
Yep.
Jimmy Buffett's catalog, and it runs 130 some
Or
performances on Broadway.
there was there's one of all Elvis music. There was one, I
Yes, all
mean,
shook
like
up. Yes,
just
yes, the Beach Boys
yeah, and then
that didn't
it's just
go.
flash in the pan gone.
Totally. And that's a conversation that's worth having. And I'm still not to a point in writing this book where I can really give a hypothesis as to why I think that is, but I'm hoping I better get there before the book is finished. So at any rate, I'm doing that, writing and editing the Essential series. And as I've alluded to earlier, I'm a homeschooling mom of two preteen boys. Jones is just turned 12, and Freddie is 10. And my little Freddie Bear has informed me that he wants to be a historian when he grows up. And I don't think for 2 seconds that that will last, but he does say that at this moment. So that's exciting. I want to end talking about myself by saying my favorite musical, because I think that's a logical question for people to
Yeah.
ask in this context. My favorite musical is The Drowsy Chaperone for a number of reasons. It's hilarious. It's relatable. It's a man listening to cast recordings in his apartment all alone. I mean, that sounds like college to me. So that that sounds very relatable. And it's one act. It's one act. And that's another thing we can talk about at a later time, about this trend towards one act musicals and how I am such a fan of them.
I'm a huge fan of 90 minutes, no intermission.
Yes,
It's my
agree.
favorite thing ever now.
Agree. So, Tracey, in the spirit of timeliness, let's now talk briefly about why study musical theater history, or why study theater history in general. What do you think? What makes it important?
I think it's a really good question to talk about because theater history, I think a lot of people don't understand why studying history is so important. And part of the reason I think it is because we learn about humanity, right? We learn about why people do what they do, why things were done the way they were done, what they are in conversation with. It also brings up really interesting conversations about bias and the viewpoint of the historian. I think there's a lot of things to talk about there. But I think for me, I found very, very early that I was more interested about what the musical was responding to than the musical itself. And that sounds pretty weird because I'm a director and I love the musicals themselves and I understand the mechanics and there's love and passion for it as a work of art and for its development and things like that. But um I think I said earlier, I wrote my dissertation on John Philip Sousa musicals, of all things. If you ever run across one of these, please don't see it. They are awful. They really are. I mean, you're laughing, but they are,
Never seen one. I'll be honest, I've never seen one.
and you don't need to. You don't need to.
I won't. Trust me.
Um, John Philip Sousa was so funny because he was notorious for once he was done with, a piece of art or musical piece or something that he did, it was kind of out of sight, out of mind. I don't care as long as it's making me money,
Yeah.
which kind of lent itself to the fact that many of his musicals were rewritten after he walked away from them
Yeah.
to sell products,
Right.
to deliver propaganda, etc. and so on. And one of the things that I found specifically on John Philip Sousa musicals, and we can talk about this if we ever get to the episodes on American operetta, we ever really talk about those things, was just how much the government relied on John Philip Sousa's kind of his celebrity status of, the father of Americanism, and that's
Right.
who he thought he was, to sell foreign policy.
Yeah, well, they did it later with Irving Berlin too. I
Exactly.
mean, that was yip yip yar, yeah. Like that was Irving Berlin, that's all through his catalog of music.
Exactly. And so it's like there's actually like connections that you can see with the government where they're rewriting things or rewriting from speeches or something, rewriting the musical to send that foreign policy out and about the country.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought it was fascinating because I was like, you're right, they didn't have radio at this point. They only had newspapers, and newspapers were kind of hit and miss. So this was actually another really great way to get the word out.
Right. Absolutely.
And so, I thought that that's what excited me about history. I was like, what are these musicals in conversation with? Like, why this musical right now? Because I think the thing that people don't quite understand is that musicals do not exist in a vacuum. There's a reason they're written and when they are written. And they're
Right.
always in conversation to what's going on around them.
Well, and I have quoted it so many times it became a cliche when I was in graduate school. But William Inge, great playwright, said theater is, of course, a reflection of life. And
Yes.
so that's speaking directly to your point, that that really, they're not going to make theater just for theater making's sake, or at least most creators aren't, right? There is a reason. It's to respond, it's to
Hmm.
articulate. There's a reason for it.
Exactly. So, I mean, while you may be Dr. Broadway, I'm more kind of like Dr. American musicals are the like artistic product of the United States. Like
Right.
I'm kind of I truly believe that musical theater is what America has to offer the rest of the world autistically? No.
Right.
Artistically,
Right. I'm tracking. I'm with you.
you know,
Yeah.
I think that it is so important that we see it that way as well. Um, and so when you start understanding kind of the background in that conversation, I think it gives you um, a wider world to appreciate the musical. It
Hmm.
also helps, I think, a lot of students. When I teach it to BA students, it's very different than how I teach theater history to BFAs. BFAs need to know, yes, what they're in conversation with, but it's because they're creating characters, and many of them are still kind of using acting systems that ask them to kind of relate things with real life circumstances.
Hmm.
And they need to understand what is actually happening at this moment. We're gonna do Oklahoma here very, very soon. And one of the things I love to talk about with Oklahoma is having gone through all of Hammerstein's um, information, all of his notes, all of his sketchbooks, everything for Oklahoma at the Library of Congress. One of the things that you realize really, really quickly is that that musical has a whole lot to do with the amount of Hammersteins in Eastern Europe who are writing to him as someone who has a name and saying, "Help get
Help
me out of
us.
here."
Yeah. Right.
So those are the things that I try to kind of bring to the students as well, is to just kind of highlight this. This is the world that you're living in. This is how you get into that world. But I think for the audience goer, that's not as important as it is to kind of sit back and be able to say, here's the historical framing
Right. And
of
I
the
think
show.
that's where you and I will work very well together, because you can speak so much to that wider context, that what in culture, what in society is this show responding to. What I like to do is get
Yeah.
very, very, very deeply in the weeds and
Yes.
talk about like the most minute detail about the creation of a musical. And so that is how, our career paths have gone differently. And you have been
Hmm.
speaking to theater students who need that kind of contextualization. I've been speaking to theater patrons primarily. And so,
Yeah,
like you said, their interest is, I'm going to see a show in 30 minutes. What do I need to know to help me better understand it? To
exactly.
help me, and that's where educating theater goers, enhancing theater going came from, is how much more richly you can experience a show when you go in knowing a little bit more about its background. So I'm going to give you just a couple of examples, and I'm going to start with probably my favorite one, which is Cats.
Oh
Fifth
dear.
longest running musical in Broadway history, right? It was just passed by Wicked in August of 2023. Fifth longest running musical in Broadway history. Now, I can't tell you how averse I am to this show. And God bless those who have been in it and directed it and who love it. More power to you. However, it is not for me. But let me tell you something. As I went in to speak about it and I did all this, like I said, I got down in the weeds and I found out where it came from. Suddenly, I didn't
Hmm.
hate it. I
Hmm.
kind of enjoyed seeing it because I understood more where it came from. So let me talk a little bit about it. So it was, of course, written by Andrew Lloyd Webber. Andrew Lloyd Webber had already had the success with Tim Rice, his
Hmm.
lyricist, with Jesus Christ Superstar, they had written Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, though it had not yet been on Broadway. They had written Evita, and it was Evita, directed by Hal Prince. He was that was kind of a breaking point for Lloyd Webber. Andrew Lloyd Webber decided that he he hated technical rehearsals, and in this one
Oh
particular
yeah.
technical rehearsal, the balcony for Ava to stand and deliver her, climactic number, Don't Cry for Me, Argentina, it doesn't come in. right? So there is no climactic number. And Andrew Lloyd Webber is about to lose his mind over this,
He apparently has
understandably.
like the most outrageous theatrical temper on the
Oh,
planet. Yeah,
yes,
I mean,
exactly,
it's
exactly.
like,
So, but listen, this is what's so interesting about it is so that is what's happening. And by the way, he was already kind of miffed with Tim Rice as his collaborator, and they had a famous falling out not real long after that. So those are the things that are at play. And so in order to calm himself down, because he realizes he has this temper, and he doesn't want to be in page 6 because of it, right?
yeah,
So, in order to calm himself down, he starts quoting to himself from T.S. Eliot's Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats.
yes.
Now, this book was published in 1939, and Andrew Lloyd Webber's mother read it to him when he was a child. And so he started reciting, like, calming himself down by seeing if he could recite those poems to himself.
Yeah.
Well, that moment stuck with him. And he decided after collaborating with Rice for those three, I mean, talk about 3 shows that have had enormous success
Yeah.
and really were part of changing the shape of the musical. Um, he decided, you know what, I'm going to try if I can make a musical without a collaborator. And so that's exactly what he did. It wasn't intended to be a West End or Broadway musical. It was just intended to be this
Hmm.
thing that he did and performed at his home, or had performed at his home. And he took it to Hal Prince, like I said, who had directed Evita. And Hal Prince was like all of us. Hal Prince was like, huh? Like I'm not getting it. And
Yeah.
and it was right at the time when Margaret Thatcher had been elected prime minister in the UK. And so Hal Prince was like, is this a
Is this a
is this a
metaphor
metaphor?
for
Like is this a Margaret Thatcher thing? And Andrew Lloyd Webber said, Hal,
it's about
it's
cats?
about cats. And
Which
when
ends
you
up
go,
being a famous line in, okay, I'm gonna blank on it now. Oh my
I don't
gosh.
know. I don't I
Angels in
can't help you.
America.
Who?
In Angel in America. It ends up being a famous line in
Oh, I
Cats.
didn't even
It's
think about
about
that.
cats.
It's about cats.
Yeah.
But when you see cats, and you're not like Hal Prince sitting in the audience going, like, wait a minute, I'm trying to get the deeper meaning. When you
Yeah.
know from the creator himself, it's about cats,
Hmm.
then you can just relax and enjoy the show,
Yeah.
right? It just changes everything. And so that is what I'm here to do. I am here as we go through these shows. I am here to say, okay, here is how it happened. Here is why it happened. Here is who it happened because of.
Hmm.
Now I'm going to kick it to Tracey, and Tracey's going to tell you what they were reacting against, what the world was like at that moment in time, how it fits into the other shows that were coming at that same time. Was it, was this a groundbreaking, change everything kind of musical, or was this a throwback because we needed some theatrical comfort food in that moment in
Hmm.
time? That's going to be Tracey's job. My job is to get in the weeds and tell you stories like how it's about
Hmm.
cats.
And how memory wasn't there until about a
Right.
week ahead of
Right.
opening. So
Exactly.
it's like
Exactly.
lots and lots of fun stories about the development process. Like,
Yes, there's so many. And like I said, that's truly when I say enhancing theater going in my tagline. Yes, you can enjoy a piece of theater without knowing this, but
mhm,
it is enhanced when you understand where it came from, right? It just makes it
mhm.
that much better. Like Spinal Tap, it takes it to 11, right? It goes to 11 when you know the background of the show. So I'm here to take it to 11.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you.
Like my friend Nigel Tufnell. So that's what I'm here for. And now, Tracey, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what the next steps look like for this podcast, where we're going from here.
So we're going to do a couple episodes that do some nuts and bolts, and then we're going to jump into kind of what's on tour right now because we think that's going to be really, really helpful to folks. And then we'll keep adding to that as we go through. The way we've kind of set this up is that we have this kind of introduction right here, and this is the part that you're going to want to know. We're going to do a series of like timeline episodes, um, which basically just walk through theatrical timelines, whether that's, the history of American stage theater or the history of musical theater, depending on what's out there right now. We'll probably start with musical theater because I'm sorry,
Because we are
that's
musical theater historians.
and it's just more fun. But so yeah, I mean, we'll start with musical theater. I think that's the next two episodes that we're gonna do. We're gonna do basically something that says, here's the timeline from the beginning of the US's kind of creation to Oklahoma. And then we're going to do another episode that talks about everything Oklahoma to the end. And so it's like theater history in an hour and a half is essentially what you're getting. You're getting kind of the overview. I've just always found that this is really, really helpful because you're like, where is this in the timeline? What came before it? What came right after it? And it gives you a little bit of information there. Then we're going to do a series of what I'm calling right now era episodes where we can just talk about the theatrical era, like if we just want to talk about the golden age, which the golden age of musical theater is from Oklahoma to about West Side Story. So 1943 to 1959, 57, 59-ish.
Okay, so I'm going to stop you right there because I think a lot of people, myself included, would take it to hair. So why do you break it at West Side Story?
Oh no.
Okay, we can save this
Oh no.
conversation for later.
Yeah, we can save that. Okay, we're going to save that conversation for
Okay,
later.
come back later for that conversation.
But here's a one sentence explanation.
Please.
If it starts with Oklahoma, you start with an integrated musical. And when you get to West Side Story, it is the fully integrated musical. It is the apex of the kind of triangle. And then after they've perfected the integrated musical, then they start messing with it.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's why I don't take it farther than that.
Right.
But
and I think just the con, and like I said, we'll go more deeply into this. But I'm just speaking now for people who are listening, go like, wait a minute.
Wait a minute.
I thought it was hair. Because I think that's kind of, we think that's the one that shattered you're right. It was fracturing all along the way. So
just
anyway,
little
yes.
changes, little changes, little changes.
Yes. Yeah,
and right. I think that so we're going to do these era episodes, and this is the kind of conversation that you're going to get. Like, why wouldn't we put this together with, say, Fiddler on the Roof or Cabaret? And I'm like, okay, well, let's look at what those two musicals are trying to do. It's very different in scope than what the Golden Age musicals are trying to do.
Absolutely.
They're completely messing with the integrated musical format. They're trying to turn things on their head, and so they're fundamentally different. Anyway, so I think that will, I think, help too. There's lots of eras.
Tracey,
obviously.
Can I just pause for just 1 second here and make this point? Because I think we've talked about this and how important it is for our listeners to understand, because we certainly understand it, that within the study of history, people have different opinions, right?
Yes.
And sometimes there's space for that, and we hold that space as sacred, right? To understand that those different opinions will pop up, and we have facts can only take us so far, at which point we start extrapolating things for ourselves and making our own cases for things. And that's what we are here to do. So
we're here to argue.
Celebrate that, right? We celebrate that.
There's no such thing as, I tell my kids this all the time. I'm like, you're not proving anything.
Right.
You're arguing
you're
for something.
Your case.
And that's especially true of musical theater, because honestly, in the academic community, musical theater wasn't something that was respectable until about 20 years ago. Like, they weren't doing anything. They kind of laughed at you. Both of us have stories about how graduate schools were like, we don't do that.
Yeah, can't do that. Can't help you. We can't help you with that.
So much of the information we have, and so much of the era headings, all of these kinds of things that we understand about theater have been done by lay historians. And I'm so thankful for that work.
Amen.
So thankful for that work that they've done. But then as we've come along behind, because we didn't, academic historians did not get on board with it, as we've kind of come behind them, we have found more to add to that, to kind of their basis. Yeah. And it's just provided a different picture, I think. So the thing that I've loved the most in the last 20 years of, being a musical theater historian has literally just been how much the timeline has changed
Yeah.
in the amount of time that I've been teaching. I've been teaching musical theater history as a class for almost 20 years now.
Yeah.
And I can show you the timelines that we gave them at the beginning of that time and what they look like now, and
Right.
they're drastically
Drastically
different.
different. And
So,
I will say, just, from my own perspective, I think that there's probably some sort of psychological insight to who I am as a human being that I like to play in the facts
yeah.
because the ambiguity makes me a little bit uncomfortable. Even
Mm,
though I know it's there and I know it exists, I certainly understand that. But I do think it's easier for me to deal with finite things that I can prove from firsthand accounts.
hmm
I can look at somebody's papers, or I can read reviews and know I know because
Yeah.
the ambiguity is uncomfortable, but
hmm
nevertheless it exists, and there is space for people to look at the same information and draw different conclusions, so
Yeah.
long as they don't disagree with what is factual.
Yeah. And the, just kind of another thing about musical theater, there's not a lot of facts when you get
Right.
back I mean, I've spent most of my career writing about early American musical theater, like 1800, like 18, late 1800s, early 1900s, and they threw everything away
Mhm.
because they didn't realize that this was going to be a topic of study. They didn't
Right.
realize it was so important. So a lot of things were piecing together, and there are big gaping holes. I tell
Absolutely.
I tell everybody, like, I wrote a dissertation on John Philip Sousa, and the Sousa family burned all of his correspondence after
Gosh.
he died.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
So
I
I'm
one
literally going to London to try to see if London has that side of the letter, or
yeah.
like that's what you end up doing.
Yeah.
So there is going to be a lot of ambiguity, and there's going to be a lot that changes. We're going to give you the best information that we have that's out there right now. But
Yeah.
I mean, I just feel like every day another friend and another colleague or something is finding something new. So it's what's exciting about it. And you have to learn to kind of see it as the ambiguity is exciting.
And it is an ongoing endeavor. The pursuit of learning any
Yeah.
kind of history is ongoing. The more that I research, I keep a list of other things that I come across. I'm
Yeah.
like, oh gosh, dig into that. Oh man, that sounds interesting.
Yeah.
There's just so much out there to dig into that time won't allow us to get into all of it.
Yeah.
But I do think I do want to make that important note because I know we've talked about it from our own work, how we've had to become comfortable with that and
Yeah.
say, this is what I can say now based on this, but I give myself the grace to change my mind based on what may come subsequently. And to your point about John Philip Sousa's family burning all of his things, I will never forget speaking with Dorothy Fields' son, David Lom. As I was preparing for my master's thesis. And here I am thinking, oh, this was such art. It was they just blood,
Yeah.
sweat, and tears to create this gorgeous whatever. And I was very naive as a 20 whatever year old whose parents would not let her go to London
To
on her
London.
own. And he looked at me and he was like, it was a job. She did it for money. Like, it wasn't art for so many. It was a
Yeah.
job. It was the way she supported her family. So
hmm
what difference, why would she keep 75 different versions of, it's not where you start, it's where you finish, right? Like, why
Exactly.
would she keep that? Because it didn't matter. It was the song for the show.
hmm
Next, right?
hmm
And so that's something that you have to come to terms with too as you're researching is their perspective on things were very different perhaps than our perspective now as we look back and consider people to be quote unquote the greats.
hmm
Um, and maybe they didn't consider themselves to be that in the time that they were writing, so they
Or
didn't leave us with
maybe
a whole lot to study.
or maybe we erased them
Amen. That
from the
that is
narrative.
another topic of
That is
conversation.
yeah. My kids always laugh at me because I'm like, okay, so Rodgers and Hammerstein, the fathers of the American musical, maybe not. Maybe it was the guys that did Shuffle Along, and we just said,
Right.
shh,
UB
you
Blake and
know,
Noble Sissel. Absolutely.
exactly.
And it is uncomfortable. Um, I've even had this experience teaching, and you probably have too, where you're teaching something as fact and you're like, but wait a minute, what about,
Oh yeah.
like in the back of your head, you're like, I don't think this is right.
I think that's in my opening lecture every year. I'm like, I'm going to teach you something emphatically that we are going to find out is wrong in like 10
Amen.
years.
Humility. I think humility has to go along with being a historian, right?
Well, yeah, and you just have to look at it. It's like, this is what I know
Right
right
now.
now.
Exactly.
This
Exactly.
is what I'm arguing for right now.
Absolutely.
That's it.
Yes. And I'm sorry to interrupt your conversation about, I think you were at
Yeah, I know.
episodes, and
Okay,
I'm
so here's
sorry
how
to
we do
interrupt
this.
that, but I knew we wanted to make
We
that
did.
point.
So we'll have those timeline episodes, and we're going to do a couple of those up front. So you can always kind of access that, learn what happens before and after, kind of in a timeline format. Era episodes where we talk about kind of what the era is doing. Um, and then we're going to talk about those individual musicals. And this is really where Kristin, I mean, you really thrive in this world
Hmm.
about talking about the nuts and bolts of these musicals. So we'll do like the first one I think we're going to do is Oklahoma because it is kind of the linchpin in the timeline.
Hmm.
Um, and we're just going to dive into everything you need to know about Oklahoma to see it, to watch it, to make sure that it is an experience for you um, that Rodgers and Hammerstein wanted it to be. Hammerstein wants you to leave the theater thinking about that show. He
Hmm.
wants that is kind of like the hallmark of kind of what he brought to musical theater in a lot of ways.
And
And the
I think
fact
we
that
need to
you
punch that word thinking,
yes,
thinking
he
about
wants you to
it.
think about it, and everybody's going to think something different. But what did you get from this? Does it stay with you?
Hmm.
I said this to creators at Palace all the time. I was like, the best musicals are the ones where people are able to have conversations about it as they leave the theater.
Right.
Like, oh my gosh, what they did this and that happened, and it's not just mindless. Oh, that was a lovely show. Now,
Right.
there's a
Let's
lot
go get
there.
dessert. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So we'll do the timelines, the eras, and then we're just going to do a blitz of individual musicals. I think as we said before, we're going to start with kind of what's on tour right now, to make sure that that's kind of in our archives. Um, and then we'll just fill it out from there. Because at a certain
Yeah.
point, we're going to have to kind of stretch out and start going back in time and look at
Right.
some of the older musicals too, which I love them. They are my
Yeah.
favorite things.
Yeah. Same.
um,
Same.
so we'll do that. We're also kind of toying with some ideas about talking about form and style. Um, but those are things that sometimes you're really interested in and some people are really not. So we're trying to keep something like form and style, like musical style and kind of the setup of the arc of the narrative and that kind of information. We're going to try to do that in their own episodes. So if you're going to see a musical, you should be able to kind of search our little archive and be able to say, okay, I'm going to listen to um, the timeline episode where this show falls. I'm going to listen to the era, and then I'm going to listen to
Specific
the
show and
specific show and you will
yeah.
have tons of information by which to process what you're about to see. But you can also just watch or just watch. I guess you can watch this.
I
Yeah,
guess.
we'll be able to watch and listen, but you'll also be able to just kind of look at that individual musical episode and have more than enough information to go on.
Right.
We want to make it so that there's not tons of extraneous information that people are like, get to the nuts and bolts if you're a
Right.
nuts and bolts person, or get to the cultural stuff if that's your bent. It's trying to kind of expand the episode so that people can get what they want a little bit more easily. So that's how we're setting this up as we launch
Right.
the
And
podcast.
we have gone, afield of this goal. Our goal for each episode is to keep it right around 30 minutes. We
Mm-hmm.
understand that time is precious. I know that when I go to find a podcast to listen to, if I see it super long, I'm real unlikely to dig into it. So we want to try to keep it right at 30 minutes. Though again, this introductory episode has gone a little bit longer than we had anticipated. That's
Yeah.
nevertheless the aim going forward. But
we
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 got a
kept
lot to
talking
say.
we
We got a
kept
lot to
talking about the
say.
fact that like the two of us, I was like, we should just be able to chat back and forth. Like that's the whole, we do that very well. And I think we
Right.
do it a little too well, friend.
I think, I think maybe,
we need
maybe
to
that's true.
maybe we need to,
Maybe we need to script it.
I
Maybe
know.
that's the
Oh
answer.
my
Script
goodness.
it. I know. I know. So, Tracey, anything that we need to say about anything before we wrap it up for this episode?
No, the next episode that you'll see kind of chronologically is we're going to start in the middle. So we'll start at Oklahoma and we'll do an individual musical episode on Oklahoma. And then the following two will be timeline episodes, but that's where we're starting. Yeah.
And I want to just make a point because I think you articulated it to me really, really well when we were talking about this podcast. Is the reason that Tracey suggested that we start with Oklahoma is because the musical theater paradigm is completely situated on the tent pole of Oklahoma, right? Everything after, but it is before Oklahoma and after Oklahoma. And so Tracey made the outstanding point that if we start with Oklahoma as kind of this penultimate example, then we know what we're comparing before Oklahoma and post West Side Story or Hair, depending on where you fall in that spectrum. You understand, what is happening. And so I thought that was a really, really smart idea to start with Oklahoma. And it was Tracey's idea, so I give her full credit. But that way you understand what was the perfect example or what is considered by so many to be, and then you can see what came before it and how it differs from that epitome of Oklahoma, and what came after it and how they started to fracture. And then we start getting into concept musicals and all those other things that come after that. But it is important to understand the penultimate example before you do that.
Exactly.
So I love that idea of Tracey's. All right, so that'll do it for this episode of the Dr. Broadway podcast. Tune in next time when, as Tracey's already said, we'll be talking about Oklahoma. I'm so excited. Until then, connect with us via email at hello@Dr. Broadway or on Instagram and TikTok at Dr. Bway Podcast. Thanks so much for joining us, and we hope to see you here again real soon.